Hi, this is a video for GCSE English Literature, an inspector calls, and we have a particular focus on the character of Sheila Birling. So we're going to start off with Sheila's character, and we'll just go through the very basic facts about Sheila to remind you of who she is. So firstly, she's engaged to Gerald Croft. He's a wealthy, I'll put a money bag here, he's a wealthy man. He's the son of a very successful business owner, and he's actually Sheila's social superior. Her brother is Eric, and Eric's the one with the drink problem. And she is daughter to Arthur and Sybil Birling, and we'll come to more on their relationship with Sheila soon. Now, Arthur and Sybil are also business owners, but not quite as successful as Gerald's family. This is why they very much like Sheila's relationship with Gerald, and it's important to them that this relationship and marriage goes well because it's of benefit to them. Let's move on to Sheila and how she changes through the play, because this is an important part of her character, and we'll start off with Sheila at the start. And we're going to put a picture of a young girl here because at the start of the play Sheila is very young in Act 1. She's certainly immature, and just give you some quotations here. One thing she says is, "I'm sorry, Daddy, actually I was listening." Very immature thing to say, not just the word daddy, but it sounds like something a child would come out with. She's self-centered, so talking about getting the girls sacked in the shop, she says, "I told him that if they didn't get rid of that girl, I'd never go near the place again." She's materialistic and possibly naive about marriage. She says, "Isn't it a beauty? Now I really feel engaged." Talking about her engagement ring, it's clear that the ring perhaps means more to her than the prospect of marriage. And Sheila's had a very sheltered life, so she's got very little idea of what life is like for anyone else. She says, "I can't help thinking about this girl destroying herself so horribly, and I've been so happy tonight. Oh, I wish you hadn't told me." Now here I've put that second part of that quotation in red because it almost sounds like she's upset because she's been told, not because the girl has died. Now, all of that is in Act 1. And what we're going to do now is we're going to move on, and we're going to look at Sheila in Acts 2 and 3, and she's matured. So she's come out of her shell a bit, and she's become a young woman, and she's certainly become assertive, especially in the context of the 1910s when women weren't expected to be assertive. She says, "Then I'm staying," and this is in response to being told to go. So she stands her ground and stays in the room. She's realistic about Gerald. So she says, "So that's what you think I'm really like. I'm glad I realised it in time, Gerald." She doesn't have this sugar-coated idea about her relationship with him, and she's not afraid of losing him, when you look at that quotation. She accepts responsibility for the way that she's behaved in the past. She says, "I know I'm to blame and I'm desperately sorry." And lastly, I think we'll put on here that she's mature. So she says, "No, Mother, please." And it's not just the use of the word mother. I know you can contrast that with mummy. You need to be a little bit careful there, because a woman of Sheila's class probably would have called her mother mummy. It's not necessarily the only thing that stands out as immature. The change to the use of the word mother indicates a maturity, but also this phrase, she's bossing her mum around, and I think that's partly where the maturity lies. She's not just being passive and childlike here. In fact, we can put highlight that word mother, because it is important, but just be aware that there's perhaps a little more to it. Okay, she is perceptive, so she has an understanding of what's going on. She says, "He's giving us the rope." so that we can hang ourselves. And this is about the inspector. She's got a clear understanding of what's going on, definitely more so than her parents. Sheila learns from the inspector, or certainly learns from the visit, that it's nothing just to laugh about. Remember, her parents are laughing at the end. She says, "I tell you, whoever that inspector was, it was anything but a joke." Let's move on now to Sheila's relationship with others. And I'm going to deal with Sheila's relationship with Gerald and her parents. Those are the two important ones to look at. We'll start with Gerald. So this is her fiancé, and yet it's clear that she doesn't trust him. She says, "Except for all last summer when you never came near me." This really indicates to the audience that Sheila has a strong idea that he's not being entirely faithful, deep down maybe, but she knows. She also says, "I expect you've done things you're ashamed of too." Again, indicating she's got some kind of insight into him and his true character. And Gerald seems to have a low opinion of Sheila as well, so he says, "You've been through it, and now you want to see somebody else put through it." It's not... I'm going to put an extra note here for you. Perhaps suggest that Gerald thought that Sheila wanted to stay in the room to watch him being grilled by the inspector, so maybe indicating that he thinks of her as vindictive or mean-spirited. And, you know, it's not an ideal thought to have of your fiancé, especially that coming out on their engagement celebration. So, something to consider. Sheila's understandably angry, I suppose, that Gerald was cheating on her. She says, "You're forgetting that I'm supposed to be engaged to the hero." When they were talking about Gerald and his relationship with the girl. And this is sarcastic, and it was not the done thing for a woman of her class to be sarcastic, especially not at the dinner table. So we'll put a note on the board for you there. And talking about Gerald, he treats Sheila like a child, and again it's quite common in the context, but he says things to her like, he says about her, "Inspector, I think Miss Birling ought to be excused. She's had a long and tiring day." That's very much something that you would say about a toddler, that, you know, they need to go to bed, they've had a long and tiring day. And this is meant to be her future husband, treating her like a baby. Sheila actually regains some respect for Gerald when he's, I'm going to write, eventually honest about past events, perhaps suggesting a forgiving side to her, or maybe a mature side. She says, "I rather respect you more than I've ever done before," now that he's, come clean. We'll move on to her relationship with Mr. and Mrs. Birling. And these two treat Sheila like a child, and this never changes. This remains true throughout the play. We'll start with Mrs. Birling, some of the things she says. She says, "You seem to have made a great impression on the child, Inspector," calling her daughter the child. She says, "Sheila, what an expression. Really the things you girls pick up these days." That's when Sheila's called her brother Squiffy, meaning Squiffy means drunk. But Mrs. Birling's telling Sheila off as though she was a teenage girl, and remember, this is a engagement party. Sheila's a grown woman. Mrs. Birling says, "You're looking tired, dear. I think you ought to go to bed." Again, perhaps something you might say to a young child. And in fact, I'm actually going to put a highlight around the words "the child," because I think that's an important one for you to remember, and it's quite easy to learn. Mrs. Birling also says to Sheila, "Please don't contradict me like that." So there's lots of telling off coming from Sheila's mum. Not something that necessarily happens when you're an adult. We'll move on to Mr. Birling. And it's important, I just want to make a note here, that Mr. Birling's not as rich or successful as Gerald Croft's father. He's also of a lower social class, and he's pleased about Sheila's engagement because of the connections it will bring him. It seems to be more pleased about that than his daughter's happiness. He says, "This is one of the happiest nights of my life." I think that's certainly a quotation you could remember. And your father and I have been friendly rivals for some time now. That's Mr. Birling talking to Gerald. And this is in his big speech. And again, the focus seems to be on Mr. Birling, how Mr. Birling will benefit from Sheila's engagement, rather than how Sheila will be live happily ever after, or what you'd normally hear at an engagement party. When Sheila asks what's happening, he says, "Nothing to do with you, Sheila, run along." And I think those words, "run along," say a lot about the way Mr. Birling sees his daughter, you know, just as a young child. Sheila says to her dad, the point is, you don't seem to have learnt anything. So, you know, Sheila stands up to her father, and by the end of the play, she certainly has more insight than he does. Let's talk about Priestley's message. So remember, when he's writing the play, he's communicating messages to us, and Sheila represents the next generation who are willing to change and learn from mistakes, and certainly this generation had to repair some of the mistakes made by their parents' generation. Sheila is compassionate, so she's worried, especially after Act 1, about the girl, and seems genuinely concerned for what's happened. Sheila has some socialist views, and again, this is meant to reflect this next generation who weren't all conservatives. I'm going to put something here for you. Sheila sympathises with the strikers, and so we've got a quotation here that she sees that the girls who are on strike aren't cheap labour, they're people. This next generation that Sheila represents were able to take responsibility for their actions, and again, Priestley showing us that Sheila and the future generations would be able to take social responsibility and, you know, look after one another. Remember, the play is set just before World War I, and this was a time of economic depression, and importantly for Sheila's character, women had very few rights. So Mrs. Birling has been of the generation that didn't have rights, and Mrs. Birling says to Sheila, when you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do spend all their time and energy on business. I've cut some parts out of that quotation, but that's the essence of it. She's telling Sheila, you know, when you're married, you just have to put up with these things as a woman. Now, shortly after the play started, shortly after the play was set, we had World War I, and remember, the audience would have known this because it wasn't written till much later, and the suffragettes were founded just shortly before the play and was set, and women's rights were beginning to be recognised. So Sheila is of the generation of women who were starting to have professions and equal rights with men. Equal rights were a long way off, but, you know, she was of that generation that was just beginning to have those rights, and that's what Priestley's communicating to us through this play and through this character. I hope that's of use. Any questions below, and please do watch the other videos. Thank you very much.